government has not complied with because of this need to get quick revenue in order to sustain its socioeconomic policy. So it's a trade-off, and that's actually the trade-off that many Latin American governments are facing, and especially for those on the left, like Ecuador and Bolivia. In the case of Bolivia, with an indigenous president, the first indigenous president in a country that has a large indigenous population, actually the majority of the population. It creates big tension. In practice, however, if you believe in the possibilities of less predatory extraction of resources and support the view of indigenous people, those cases, those countries are not very hopeful at this time.
Okay, I've got a question there. Yes, go ahead, yourself.
Hi Cesar, thank you for that presentation. I just wanted you to talk a bit, you spoke about the differences for South-South collaboration and what we need to think about in terms of South-South collaboration. In terms of movements and solidarity of movements across Latin America and Africa, particularly if we think what are the possibilities that exist there, particularly if we think about Brazil's role in Southern Africa. We have the Vale mining company in Brazil and the communities affected by Vale in Mozambique, and what kind of scope is there for solidarity across the regions. And the second part of my question was, you spoke about the differences in terms of in Latin America, the tendency and the argument is being for no to extraction versus in Africa sharing in the resources. What's your take on that, and what's your perspective in terms of, was this a debate that was had in Latin America? Have movements agitated in the way that the movements are speaking about it in Africa? Is that something that's being done? Are there lessons that have been learned? And what's your view?
Okay, I've got another question here. Yes, sir.
Oh, mine is for Richard.
Fine.
Can I go ahead?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. When you started off your presentation, actually, you started off on a very positive note around this indigenization business. And I was looking forward to some lessons from Zimbabwe. There have been sentiments in this country about what can be learned from Zimbabwe. Maybe not so much in terms of the mining sector, but land reform and things like that. But then when you actually expanded on your points, it sounded like another smoke screen. Could you throw some light on whether we there are lessons from the Zimbabwe case study? Thanks.
Yeah, I've got a question here. I've had a request from the camera person that the questioner should stand. Yes.
Hello, my name is Luis Campos from the Argentinian Workers' Union, the CPR. Hola, Cesar.
Hola.
I would like to go back to the Carl question, to the leader of the indigenous community in Colombia, because I think that it's not an African question for a South African social leader, but also could be a Latin American question from many leftist movements, even many left political parties or political groups, to these groups. So I think that probably it's not a question of difference between regions, but also within the regions. I think in the Argentinian context, we have strong discussions between, for example, the miners, workers, associations, and the groups who are fighting against the mining. So this is also within our national context. So I would like to ask, especially Cesar, if you really think that in all the region, especially from the left movement, from the left perspective, you're finding a non-extractive perspective, or you can find a lot of political movements from the left and political unions that are seeing the destructive issues from another point of view. Thank you.
Let's have one more comment or question from the floor, and then we'll give the speakers a chance.
Okay, my question is more of a comparative one. I mean, we look at two cases. I think both the Zimbabwean case and the Latin American case, where new debates were opened up. There was new legislation or policies that, on the face of it, seemed to be quite radical and quite promising. I mean, the most promising thing was new national debates. I think, Richard, you really emphasized that. But in both cases, a retreat, a qualification on what was achieved, a real limitation. I mean, the limitation on this very dramatic sounding indigenization policy in Zimbabwe is quite shocking, the extent to which it changes nothing. And in the case of Bolivia and Ecuador, the new approach to land, which is then rolled back by the state in the face of extractive capitalism. And I think earlier this morning we were talking about much more substantial possibilities in South Africa, and Ben Fine raised his reservations about the possibilities or prospects. So what I'm wondering, perhaps for our panelists, is in both of their cases, what would it take to shift this into something more substantive? I mean, what are the possibilities of a different kind of prospect? And I'm thinking about it particularly in relation to South Africa.
Okay, let's give the speakers a chance. In particular,
great. Thanks for the questions. Lessons from Zimbabwe. I'm sorry to have ended on a negative note. I wanted to end on a positive one, but I ran out of time. It's easy to dismiss the Zimbabwe case as saying this is populist politics and no popular delivery, an anti-popular delivery. I don't think that's very helpful. We've seen that up until now in just the 2 years of indigenization, which is a work in progress. We've seen, the weakness and malleability of the act. We've seen the power of companies to resist, to use existing agreements, the threat of capital boycotts, and we've seen disappointing outcomes for mining communities. But we've also seen resistance in new ways, which have not been possible in Zimbabwe for 15 years. In the diamond mining areas of eastern Zimbabwe, the artisanal diamond mining areas, we've had our own Marikana. In 2008, when more than 200 people were killed by the army as they tried to dispossess so-called illegal miners of the land that they were living on when they were digging for diamonds. And we've had a lot of human rights abuses since then. But we haven't had silence. There's been resistance. There's been a growing network of Zimbabwean community-based organizations as opposed to NGOs, mainly community-based organizations, which have used access to the Kimberley process and NGOs in the Kimberley process. You've used access to activists in the region to start to imagine other ways forward in Chiadzwa, at Zimplats, and other places where there are large-scale mining investments from abroad, mainly South Africa. There's been access to Pan-Africanist positions via the African Mining Vision, and thinking in public spaces about how to indigenize that too in Zimbabwe. And I think these are really positive events and processes with momentum. And just to underscore that, I'd like to say that there's big divisions within ZANU-PF as well on these issues. The fact that we've had elections almost 6 weeks ago and still no cabinet is not just about horse trading around who will succeed President Mugabe. It's precisely around this issue of how to move forward on this campaign issue and long-standing issue now of indigenization. What does it actually look like? How does one implement at least part of it without falling out of favor with the remaining constituency of the party? These are very much alive issues. I think the lesson in Zimbabwe is that the debate is there for the taking, and we do see some movement forward in the cases of Chiadzwa, the most embattled of all communities in the mining sector in Zimbabwe, managing to hold demonstrations, to put policy statements out in public, and to attend and organize things like the African Mining Endeavor, which is going on today. I think ZANU, I think the state takes cognizance of this. They need to take cognizance of this. This is not a party or a state which rules unilaterally. The second point I want to make is one that was made by the Parliamentary Mining Committee, which has been taken up since by civil society in Zimbabwe. And that is the main obstacle to a more equitable, participatory, redistributive indigenization in mining and elsewhere in Zimbabwe is the state, which has been profoundly deprofessionalized, which has been militarized, which has had breaks, if you want, between different sector responsibilities, and so much so that the Parliamentary Committee on Mining has said that the executive rules as though there is no other wing of government, rules without respect for Parliament, and instructs parliamentarians to lie to each other. These are really strong words in June of this year. And the lesson that's taken from that, the recommendations from that report, are ones that are taken up elsewhere, and it's really about rebuilding state capacity. How does one rebuild state capacity? And the answer for much of civil society and Parliament in Zimbabwe is to rebuild the status, the authority, and the profile of Parliament versus the executive, to develop a coherent legal framework through Parliament, not by ad hoc decree by one minister or by the president, by ensuring that the old rules of how you run a government, auditing, following the rules of command between parastatals and the home ministries, are followed, and ensuring, and it's something that interestingly the Parliamentary Committee took up, instilling and institutionalizing a tripartite dialogue between state, civil society, and miners. These are the ways that it's recommended. These are, if you want, the center of debate in Zimbabwe, the ways in which we restrain the predatory interests, which will always be there in the state and always be there in a dominant political party. It's the way to restrain them, to discipline them, to hold them accountable. I think that's the lesson that Zimbabwe gives us now. It's a negative lesson about how an interesting intervention around the indigenization has gone temporarily sour because of the weaknesses we've seen, but how it can be put back on track through a participatory process. I think that's the positive and very real lesson to take from Zimbabwe.
Cesar, if you could give a very brief response so that we've still got time for another round of questions.
Sure. Thanks for the question, sir. I wish I were there. These are the type of conversations that are best had in person, but I'll do my best. In terms of affected communities, the question I was making about the political economy and possibilities for solidarity among groups in the two regions. I think there are very promising and underexplored possibilities for international solidarity. One being the one that was mentioned, solidarity around cases of human rights violations by a given corporation. So groups like Justiça Global in Brazil and LRT in South Africa are working actively on corporate responsibility in different locales. I think that's a particularly difficult model because it means bringing together communities that are marginalized in their own countries, be it Mozambique or Angola or Brazil in the case of the project that Justiça Global, an NGO based in Rio, is doing, but it's particularly promising. And this is actually this is a political economy workshop. This is a key lesson that we can derive from political economy. I did my dissertation on the garment industry and union struggles against exploitation in garment factories in Central America and the Caribbean that produce for the U.S. market. And what you learn from political economy textbooks is that you have to follow the commodities, right? And in global supply chain, what you have to do is analyze the structure of the industry and look at the leverage form. And certainly, for instance, I'll give you a very specific example. We're dealing with AngloGold is the largest recipient of mining titles in Colombia. And I have on my desk a letter from the PR office of AngloGold that is like an op-ed that I wrote about a project that they're doing in southern Colombia. I would love, and certainly the communities that we work with, would love to learn more about how AngloGold operates in South Africa, how it's operated throughout history in South Africa, and whether we can engage more meaningfully with Anglo Gold in the sites that they're operating by knowing more, having more information about Anglo Gold and its history. And that's only sort of another example from South Africa. But likewise, we can, there's possibilities for doing the same with Brazilian corporations like Vale and other corporations from around the world. And another site for potential solidarity is around global governance mechanisms. And one, for example, is the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, which for all practical purposes has become sort of the key node of regulation of governance of corporate responsibility regarding human rights. So bringing together scholars and advocates working on corporate responsibility around the mandate of the UN Working Group would be another avenue. And the second cluster of questions, they're all related, so they point in slightly different directions, but for the sake of time, I'll respond to them all in one group. Basically, questions.
Cesar, maybe if I can interrupt you here, let's just see if there are any other questions at all. And let's gather them very brief, like one sentence comments or questions, and then you can have a final statement.
Okay. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier I work for a network. It's a network of NGOs and CBOs in Africa. We're in 10 different countries. And I'm just thinking around the solidarity issue. I think we did have an opportunity to meet some colleagues from Latin America, and we talked a bit about also the Inter-American Commission, the Human Rights Commission, and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And we're doing, some of us NGOs, including LRC, who's basically leading, coordinating the effort, are trying to influence the Working Group on Extractive Industries through the African Commission. But we're also doing work now with the Pan-African Parliament, but through the Committee on Justice and Human Rights. And actually, there is a huge interest among them, actually, and an opening for us to influence them potentially in the work that they'll be doing in the future. The Pan-African Parliament doesn't have legislative powers yet, but it is envisioned that it would in the future. So that's another avenue I think would be quite interesting to explore with Latin America and Africa.
Okay, I think the next question is going to be the last one.
Hi, thank you. Christopher Athich, ActionAid, South Africa. I am just a bit concerned that we seem to have framed a lot of the debate today around two centers of power. Centers of power being essentially capital and the state. And within that, we continually coming up against this brick wall, which was referred to earlier, about the more things change, the more things stay the same. And I wonder if our sort of, the fact that we're stuck within this paradigm of state and capital is part of the problem. Because we are talking about, consistently also about local communities, indigenous communities that need to have a say in the process. Yet, I don't think we may be giving it enough prominence in its ability to provide an alternative power source or alternative balance of power. So what I'm essentially saying is that perhaps the debate should be framed in a more broader sense where there is capital and state, but there's also people. And the more we empower people to become a source of power within the socio-political environment, the more we create checks and balances within our system. And certainly within the debate that we're talking about, how do we go forward, that needs to come out a lot more prominently in terms of, I think, academics, in terms of how you phrase and how you focus on that, and how we sort of take that debate forward. So I don't know, because I'm concerned because Ben Fine called it earlier, he called it the idealism of community work or people or whatever the case may be. And so that for me is a problem, that we're not giving that element prominence, and so we're not framing the debate correctly.
Okay, Cesar, I'll invite you to make a brief final comment, and then I'll invite Richard to do so as well.
Okay. I think this group of questions is the key challenge for both research and solidarity across borders within the global south, meaning how to bring together concerns and social groups that are making claims around the extractive industries that may differ from each other quite radically. I'll talk about Latin America, which is what I know best. In Latin America, we see also all kinds of configurations. For example, in Brazil, the CUCI, the large union federation, is very much for resource extraction. It's been behind the government and supporting, for example, the construction of Belo Monte, this large hydroelectric dam in the Amazon, on the basis that that energy output is needed for the Brazilian developmentalist project to go forward, right? And likewise in other Latin American countries, and even governments from the left have been big supporters of extractive industries, right? And on the other hand, you have a growing clustering of communities that are not just indigenous communities. I focused on that because that's what my recent work has been on. But recently, for example, the case of Anglo Gold operation in southern Colombia, that's not in indigenous territories. That's in peasant territories in which the peasants are opposing Anglo Gold because they argue that the gold mining will ruin water wells in the area and thus will do away with agriculture. In Argentina, there's a whole bunch of cases that are waged by, or campaigns that are waged by non-indigenous groups. And interestingly, more recently, if you look at what's been happening in Brazil, and recently in my own country, in Colombia, just last week, there's an interesting coming together of indigenous and peasant communities on the one hand, and urban, middle-class environmentalists that are opposing resource extraction. But you also have, so you have in the progressive camp both positions. And actually the recent Brazilian spring, so to speak, around the investment in the World Cup and all that, has also included incorporated an environmentalist component to it. So my short answer, of course, and I would need much more time to make justice to the questions, is both scholars and activists working around extractive industries cannot do research and activism as if climate change and looming environmental disaster were not happening. Meaning that it was one thing to think about mining and developmentalism in the mid-20th century, at the type of when the Latin American Commission on Resource Extraction, on Economic Policy, ECLAC, was developing import substitution, industrialization, and was big on mining as well. I think we need to systematically incorporate environmental concerns, and that we, and definitely in Latin America, need to take seriously the challenge coming from different social groupings that are making claims against resource extraction, and also, and importantly, taking seriously government initiatives that at this point can look like a long shot, like the Yasuni initiative in the Ecuadorian Amazon that promised not to exploit those resources in exchange for international compensation. But I don't see any other way to try to balance out those two groups of claims within the left and progressive scholarship.
Thank you very much. Okay, a brief final statement. We're out of time. So.
Yeah, of course, people are important, and civil society is important. I think one of the ways I wanted to end before I ran out of time was to talk about the need for an alternative vision, forming it beyond the realm of the legislative realm, if you want. And the challenge of doing that in Zimbabwe, of course, is that we're in a situation where the democratic vulnerability of the state and of the ruling party again is rather diminished, especially since the last elections. Nonetheless, there's lots of space to engage them in a supportive way, and I think that's what the aim of the Chiadzwa diamond miners, what the aim of the ZTTU and others is to do now. Can I say as well that there's a cross-border, I see lots of cross-border opportunities here, given the fact that the largest miners, mining companies in Zimbabwe are South African, of course, in gold, in platinum, and more service miners in the diamond sector. There is lots of opportunity, but we don't see that many linkages being formed around the profiles of these companies, where they're vulnerable, information sharing across borders, and I think there's a lot of basic empirical work that's quite easy to be done, and I would hope that it's undertaken in the near future around these companies, especially in light of indigenization.
Thank you very much to the three speakers. Including to Miles in absentia. Sadly, Miles and Cesar, Miles is gone and Cesar has to go. So Rich will have to bear the burden of answering any informal questions and so on that are to come. But thank you very much for the input.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.